Good afternoon. My name is Rubio Marín, professor of the School of Transnational Governance, directing the cluster on gender governance. Let me welcome you to Florence Live webcast series, this time to discuss women at 2020, between progress, gender backlash, and COVID, post-COVID realities. Now, we think there couldn't be any better timing for this event. Almost exactly 25 years ago these days, in September of 1995, 30,000 activists and representatives from 189 countries gathered in Beijing on the occasion of the Fourth World Conference on Women. They made a promise to the world, and the promise was equal rights and opportunities for women and girls, as well as gender equal participation. In fact, next week, on October 1st, the 25th United Nations General Assembly, which is ongoing, will host a high-level meeting to honor such occasion. Now, if any 25th anniversary of such event would be an invitation to step back, to celebrate what has been achieved, but maybe also to assess women's pending challenges, the COVID-19 pandemic only makes this task more urgent. Report after report, the strains on women's lives, health, security, and economic survival brought about by the pandemic are being documented, partly because the pandemic has been a real eye-opener, drawing attention to many everyday gender inequalities, which were there always, but maybe went unnoticed. Partly also because some of the effects of the pandemic are threatening to reverse decades of progress on gender equality and women's empowerment, and because they're doing so precisely at a time when we're also confronting, for the first time ever, a global movement to fight against such gains by portraying what is identified as gender ideology as a threat to the family and even to the sustainability of the human race. Finally, dear speakers and dear guests, I could not think of a better timing for this event, because these days we're all mourning the untimely death of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a truth global symbol of the fight for women's equality, who honored us with her visit to the European University Institute just a few years ago. You can find the interview that she was gracious enough to share with us on YouTube. Justice Ginsburg's memory reminds all of us that the fight for justice can never, never stop. May you rest in peace, dear Justice, and thank you all for all you did for us. Now, I could not think of a better set of guests to discuss these issues than the guests we have here today. We have today with us Maruša Gortnar. Maruša is the head of operations at the European Institute for Gender Equality, formerly the head of Equal Opportunities Department of the Slovenian Ministry of Labor, and a member of the European Commission Advisory Committee on Equal Opportunities for Women and Men. We also have the honor to have here with us Nahla Valji. She is the Senior Gender Advisor of the United Nations Executive Office of the Secretary General. Hello, Nahla. And finally, we have Simonetta Zarrilli, who is the Chief of the Trade, Gender and Development Program of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, a program she has been leading since its very inception in 2010. Welcome, Simonetta. Now, we will start a conversation now, but I want to invite you all to submit your questions in the comment feed in the hope that our guests can address, if not all, at least some of the questions you pose to them. And let me start maybe by addressing one huge topic, which is the topic of women's socioeconomic condition. Simonetta, it has often been said that the economic and social effects of the pandemic have fallen disproportionately on women. Why?
Thank you, Ruth, and thank you for inviting me to this event. And thank you for being with such a distinguished co-panelist. So there are many reasons, of course, why the pandemic has particularly hit women. But let me try to summarize those that for me are the main reasons. First reason is that women are many women are employed in temporary, casual, part-time employment. And this kind of jobs, this kind of insecure jobs, were the first one to be dismissed. Second reason is that many women work in the informal sector. While the situation changes in different regions, in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, 90% of working women work in the informal sector. Now, working in the formal sector means not to be able to benefit from any rescue measure, any unemployment benefit. So those women were particularly hit because they didn't have any support. And according to recent data, women working in informal economy, the income of these women fell by around 60% since the start of the pandemic. Third reason, women work in sectors particularly hit by the pandemic, especially in services. If we think about the tourism sector, it has been devastated by the social distance measures, by travel restrictions, and women are heavily employed in the tourism sector. So the halt of the sector meant many dismissals for women working there. Fourth point, access to credit. Especially in a moment of economic crisis, having fair access to credit is important to keep the business going. But we know that in many countries, virtually all countries, women have less access to credit than men. So when they most need resources to keep the business going, they face difficulties. Fifth point, we know that because of school closures, now many schools have reopened, but on a kind of bit unpredictable schedule. And the kind of care work that women are responsible for has increased. And for many women, this has had the implication has been that juggling between chore responsibilities at home and responsibility outside the household has proved impossible. So women have themselves left the labor market because they were unable to keep the two responsibilities. And finally, the problem, a serious problem, is that because of the stress, the financial stress, because of the isolation individuals and families went through because of the confinement, the level of domestic violence has increased. Now we don't have reliable data for all countries on this, but for instance, for the countries which report about domestic violence, we know that in the UK, the calls to the hotline of domestic violence has increased by 60% during the lockdown. In Myanmar, we know that it has been a threefold increase in the calls to the hotline of violence against women. And in Samoa, between March and May this year, the number of cases of violence against women that have been reported was the double of the cases reporting during the same period last year. So these are, to me, in a nutshell, the main reasons why the pandemic has hit women in a disproportionate way, as, by the way, have all other economic and environmental crises in the past. Thank you.
Thank you, Simonetta. And of course, the reasons and the effects are interconnected. And in the scenario of an increase in violence against women, with an increase in women's economic precariousness is particularly worrisome, as you know, there's no exit option when there's no economic independence. Maruša, over to you. Now, we must thank Eige, and we do so publicly, because over the last years, you have been providing us really precious data on statistics, serious statistics on women's equality according to various indexes and variables. What is your institute planning to do to further help us understand the implications of this pandemic? What is your research agenda at the moment?
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much first for having the opportunity to speak at this webinar, at this event, and we are honored to be part of this discussion, and good afternoon to everybody also following this event. Yes, from the very beginning of the pandemic, Eige has identified as well as raised awareness about different gendered impacts of COVID pandemic to our society, and our early research or surveys have shown that pandemic, of course, affects women and men differently. What we have also heard from Simonetta's presentation. And while we saw that men seem to be affected more by the coronavirus mortality, women are hit by several other aspects of this crisis and are likely to bear the brunt of the long-term consequences of this pandemic. Simonetta has mentioned care within families, care as a sector. Healthcare workers are in the front line, and care workers who are in the front line of this pandemic. Then intimate partner violence, family violence, violence against women. The service sector was hit unproportionately. So yes, our plan for the upcoming months is to work on several studies to better understand the impact of the pandemic to gender equality. We are preparing a study on implications of COVID pandemic to intimate partner violence, to violence against women. We will especially examine different measures that EU member states took to address the spike in domestic violence, intimate partner violence, and we also want to provide recommendations for possible future crises. Hopefully not, but still, yes. We will also give guidance on how to access support services, how to ensure that these support services are available. And of course, prevention is always the main part of our work. So we will examine how the violence could be prevented in the first place. And study results will be presented at our conference on gender-based violence on 18th of November. It will be a web conference, so this is kind of save the date as well for this conference. Then the second study, we will look into the socio-economic impacts of a pandemic from a gender perspective. With this study, we want to support Portuguese presidency in preparing possible conclusions of the EU Council, of the Council of the EU. And we want to make it clear to policymakers how the pandemic is affecting women's and men's economic and social situation. Then, of course, statistics, gender disaggregated statistics are at the core of our work. So we want to reflect it all. We want to reflect this impact of COVID also in our gender statistics database. We are also gathering data to underscore the importance of government's role in implementing gender-responsive procurement, gender-responsive public procurement. This is especially important during the COVID recovery and national recovery plans. At the end of October, more precisely on the 29th of October, we will publish our fifth release of Gender Equality Index. This year's focus will be on digitalization in the world of work and the consequences for gender equality. And the index thematic focus will also highlight how digitalization and the pandemic have affected women and men in their working lives. And next year, our gender equality index will focus on health and pandemic, gender impact of pandemics, especially the COVID-19, will be at the core of this thematic focus, and it will dig into key challenges and the gender inequalities that arise. Mm-hmm. So, and with this work, we also want to look into groups of most vulnerable groups of women and men during these situations.
That's right. That's right. Because of course we are just. I'm glad that you added that last line. In fact, we just got a question from Stefano Osella saying that it's important to put stress also on the impact on minority women, and he mentions trans women, migrant women, unhoused women, so that we don't, leave out the disparate impact of these effects. Now, Maruša, you mentioned the recovery plans, and there has been criticism precisely against the EU recovery plan. Mm-hmm. It has been bluntly criticized for failing to live up to gender mainstream, in spite of the, in theory, commitment of EU institutions to gender mainstreaming. Can you briefly explain why this has been the case?
Mm-hmm. Maybe just if you allow me to go back onto the comment we saw in the chat box. Yes, EIGE always takes the intersectional perspective in its research. So this intersectionality, we will look into specifically vulnerable or groups at risk of women as well as men in our work, be it on gender-based violence, intimate partner violence, as well as socio-economic implications of COVID. Okay, on the recovery plans, yeah, we mostly see women leading the health and care response on the ground. So let's say in the front lines, but they are much less involved in decision making. So there we mostly see men dominating the talks on the COVID crisis, on the exit strategy, and so on. So we can see already the outcomes of leaving women behind also in this post-COVID EU recovery plan, unfortunately. And the recent gender impact assessment, which was commissioned by the European Parliament, has shown that the recovery fund focuses on stimulating sectors with high shares of male employment, so such as IT, energy, agriculture, construction, and transport industries. Unfortunately, no gender concerns are addressed in the plan. So this, of course, poses a risk of increasing gender inequalities in employment in the EU. And as you said before, employment is very much interconnected with other inequalities as well. Yeah, so we know that the pandemic has a gender dimension, and we can't ignore it. And national recovery and resilient plans, which are of course a prerequisite for member states to receive funds under the recovery fund, EU recovery fund, should actually include mandatory national gender equality plans for recovery, or at least their national gender equality plans should have this aspect as well integrated. They should have strategies to address gender issues, including, of course, gender-based violence. And care, as it has proven to be, the care is vital part of our economies. So, but the care is often missing from the balance sheets, let's say. So that's why EIGE developed like a model that allows member states to make the connection between time use, so how we use our time for employment, leisure activities, care activities, and so on, multiple care roles, and EU funds interventions. So this should allow for a better reflection of the member states on how to value care in our economies. This is as well in line with the European EU strategy on gender equality, which highlights the need for EU funds to support work-life balance measures and initiatives. Of course, we can't undermine the importance of gender budgeting, gender mainstreaming, and gender budgeting. Gender budgeting is a strategy to achieve equal distribution of public funds, public resources. So gender budgeting can help ensure that economic recovery measures benefit both women and men and contribute to gender equality. That's why EGE has developed like a toolkit to support member states in implementing gender budgeting in the new generation of European Union funds. So all these tools are here to support gender-sensitive policy making and, of course, decision making.
Thank you, Maruša. So these days, I have seen a motto which says, we don't want to go back to normal because normal was the problem. So the question is, of course, how can we build back better, the 3 Bs? And in this regard, I wanted to ask Simonetta one question, but I just got another one from the audience, from Benedita, and I will then put the two in a line. So Simonetta, in this context where trade, of course, is being hit in various ways, we know that over the recent years, including through specific trade and gender chapters, trade agreements have expanded their interest and their efforts to mainstream gender equality considerations. They've done so also by endorsing ex ante gender impact assessments of trade agreements. What do you think is still missing? Is there any role for trade and trade agreements to contribute to building back better from a gender perspective? And then relatedly, Benedita is asking, well, she's noticing that some of the measures that countries are putting in place to support women in this context, including supporting female-intensive sectors, the informal economy, micro and small businesses, they're benefiting women, but of course, they are temporary measures. And what happens then? Are there systemic changes and initiatives or ideas to build back better? Simonetta.
Thank you. Very challenging question. First, let me briefly address why trade, why international trade in this debate, in this framework. I think that if women participate more in a beneficial way in international trade, this on one hand would speed up the recovery, there will be dynamism in the economy, and this will be beneficial for everybody. Secondly, because as we said, the women have been particularly badly impacted by the crisis. So by increasing their participation in trade, we may provide an additional instrument for them to recover from all the shortfall of the crisis. Now, I said beneficial participation in trade because we know that women are active in trade as traders, but they are active as the producer of goods that are traded. They are active as business women, as owners of businesses. Now, to make this, there is a debate, and Ruth rightly referred to it, to make this trade more inclusive and more beneficial to women. So what do we need for this to happen? Ex ante assessment, as Ruth, you mentioned, are very good instruments because it has been happening during many years is that the countries assess how a trade reform or a trade agreement can be beneficial for a country as a whole. But what is needed is to see what is the impact on different segments of the population, including between men and women. If you know what are the possible impacts a trade reform or a trade agreement can have, then you can either reconsider your reform or your negotiations, or you can already put in place buffer measure to avoid the short-term negative impacts. And in UNCTAD, we have developed a methodology for the ex-ante gender assessment of trade reforms, and the EC Commission is using our methodology for the sustainability impact assessment of trade negotiations. So we are glad of it. And this leads me to the point Maruša made about data. We have data, and we are grateful to EG for data collection and sharing of data. Still, we have shortcomings putting together trade data and gender data, because these data are collected for different purposes. They are collected, for instance, gender data are collecting looking at individuals or households, while trade data are collected on the basis of products or companies. So there is a mismatch. And we have heard the policymakers, trade policymakers who have the best intention to make the trade policy more inclusive and more beneficial for women, who say, we want to do it, but we don't have enough data to guide us. We don't know exactly. For instance, we know where women work. This we know because labor statistics are sex disaggregated, but we don't know the condition of work. Mm-hmm. Or we know the role of women as employees, but we don't know the role of women as consumers. So we, again, in UNCTAD, we are working on this problem of linking statistics, and we will be more than happy to cooperate with EG on this. Then, Ruth, you mentioned the trade and gender chapters. We know that gender considerations have been included in trade agreements, integration agreement, regional integration agreements, cooperation agreements for a long time. I mean, the first example is the Treaty of Rome. So we go back to 1957, the Treaty of Rome, or include a reference to gender equality. But now it seems that the trade community is more aware that the trade can indeed be used as a tool for gender equality. And one way of reflecting this new awareness and this new willingness is to have these gender goals and considerations clustered in a specific trade and gender chapter that are included in free trade agreements, what we call the new generation agreements. Now, this doesn't mean that these agreements can solve all problems. They are not particularly bold, and for sure they can be improved. But still, think that the trade communities for decades has denied any link between trade and gender. You know, the mantra was trade is gender neutral. Why are you talking about gender equality while we are discussing trade? So these steps are still timid steps, but are the reflection, they reflect a huge change of approach. And my last point that is connected to Benedikta's question is what should be done beyond the specific measure. We have seen that basically all countries are put in place a rescue measure. And these rescue measures, as Maruša has stressed, don't target women. You know, these measures may benefit women if they address SMEs, if they address the informal sector. So indirectly, they may benefit women, but they are not, countries have not made the effort really to say, what can we do for women? Mm-hmm. And this leads me to the idea that policy coherence is really necessary. I have mentioned how to make a trade policy more beneficial to women, but this cannot happen if women don't have the right education to meet the new opportunities that trade liberalization may open. There will not be systemic changes if women are not involved in the debate. Maruša rightly pointed out how women were excluded from the debate about what to do and how to emerge from the crisis. So I think if we go back to what were singled out as the three key domains of gender equality, that are human capital, access to resources and opportunities, and security, if these three domains are addressed in a coherent way, then we may see the kind of systemic changes that we expect. Thanks.
Thank you, Simonetta. And this takes me to women and their access to decision-making positions. You have both underscores the absence of women in the room when it comes to making the decisions. We have all this evidence of disparate impact. We have all these pool of absolutely fantastically prepared women, but it's always the man in gray suits or blue suits sitting around the decision-making tables, which is somewhat frustrating. Nahla, we know that over the last years, you have been devoted much of your energies to the implementation of United Nations Secretary General Gender Parity Strategy. Can you briefly explain to us what that strategy is, what has been achieved, or what you see as the next steps?
Great. Ruth, thank you so much for the invitation to be here today. And it's amazing just to listen and learn and hear about the work that's being done in different spaces on a common agenda that we all have. So really appreciate being here. And thank you for that question. So in 2016, when the current Secretary General was appointed to come into office in 2017, one of the first commitments that he made was to achieving gender parity in the United Nations. And he set targets and concrete commitments for that. And so the goal was to achieve parity at the senior-most levels of the UN by the end of 2021. And across the system at all levels by 2028. He has in fact achieved parity at senior leadership levels 2 years ahead of that goal. So on January 1st of this year, we had parity. We had 90 men, 90 women in our senior leadership at the highest levels, and that includes our peacekeeping missions. So for the first time, we have the highest numbers of women in as heads and deputy heads of peacekeeping missions across the world. And that was achieved incredibly quickly. And I think that it shows that this is a matter of political will and institutional transformation. And to your point, Ruth, there is no deficit of capable, committed, incredible women. But the challenge is the blockages and the obstacles are institutional, and they are they're attitudinal, and they are very much about political will. So for the first time in the history of the 75 years of the United Nations, we have parity at the highest levels. We are focused on ensuring that that is happening across all levels of the UN in the coming years. And this is really important, not just for the right to equal representation and participation, but it's also about effectiveness of our leadership, and it is about the knock-on impact that it has in modeling women's equal participation and leadership. And I think, we often draw on this case. When I was working on issues of peace and security, we used to talk about how when Bangladesh sent an all-female peacekeeping units to Liberia immediately post-conflict, that there was actually a significant and quantifiable impact on the women in Liberia, who then started to join the security sector in increased numbers. And they specifically cited the example of seeing women peacekeepers on their streets, protecting them, as what inspired them to do that. And I think we see this in countries that have quotas, that where you model women's leadership and you break our attitudinal affiliation of men with leadership, that in fact the knock-on impacts are significant. And this is really critical in this moment, because as we have seen in these last months, women's leadership during this COVID-19 crisis has gained the visibility that we've all known. We've all known about the effectiveness of gender balanced leadership, but it's really gained visibility in these past months. And so you see mainstream news media outlets such as Forbes and CNN. You see a range of studies that have come out in the last 6 months, actually looking at why it is that women's leadership during this moment has been so much more effective. We have lower rates of prevalence in women-led countries, a better alignment for socioeconomic recovery, but it's not just heads of state. It's ministers of health, it's governors, it's mayors, it's heads of hospitals. And what we see is a bold, inclusive, compassionate, evidence-based policy making and decision making that is really about inclusion and a different way of thinking. And I think this goes back to Maruša's earlier point of noting that women are 70% of those on the front lines as healthcare workers, essential workers, but they're not reflected in decision making. And what ends up happening as a result of that is that the decisions and the policies that we make reflect only half of humanity. And so we are investing in a recovery that is oriented towards male industries. And we are not looking at the fact that, as you said, Ruth, we cannot go back to a previous normal. We have to establish a new way of working, a new normal. And that means really investing in gender equal, inclusive, resilient, and climate just societies. And so investing in the care economy is one example of that. That is about supporting equality, inclusion, greater equality, but these are also green jobs. So we need to be thinking differently about what we're investing in. And we can't do that when all of the sosolutions are only being crafted by half of society.
Thank you. Nahla, I just got a question in from the audience, and Algora wants to push you on what you just said. She thinks that parity in decision making is great, but it will only be achieved at the expense of the well-off women relying on the labor of the less well-off women. So bringing an intersectionality angle here, unless the problem of unpaid care work and men's greater involvement in household is also tackled. This I have called private parity in my writings. We need that private parity without which the public parity doesn't really work, or if it works at the expense of exploiting other women. Now, is the UN taking action on this either internally, organically, or programmatically?
It's a really interesting question and a really important one, and I would just tackle it on a couple of different angles here. I think the first is, I absolutely agree, unless we are addressing unpaid care work, that is the crux of inequality in terms of labor force participation, in terms of access to education, to leisure time, to the range of rights that women have. And so unpaid care work really is a critical issue for us to address. And I think it's gained in visibility and importance during this period, because we've seen the way in which societies are incredibly reliant on care work, unpaid in the home and underpaid in society more generally. But I would question the idea that we will only reach parity of elite women at the expense of less well-off women. And I say that because I think that we need to address this question at both the micro level, as you said, Ruth, in the home. The redistribution of care work is critical. But we have to address it at the macro level. And that means incredible investment in the care economy more generally, so that all women are freed up to make choices about where they spend their time and energy. So we need to relook at our macroeconomic models. We need to look at what we value and how we value that. And if we value the resilience and the care of our societies, of our children, our sick, our elderly, that needs to be valued in our economic model. So we need to address this at both the micro and the macro level. But then I would question the idea of parity only being for the more well-off women. And I say that because I think that when we bring women in, we open the door, we raise all boats, and there's greater diversity and inclusion because of that. It opens the door to greater diversity and inclusion. And I also think that when we do that, we shift institutions. And so the assumption that we're making here is that the more well-off women will invest their time and energy in leadership and decision-making. We're making an assumption that leadership and decision-making requires a 16-hour day. But that's not a given. That is something, you know, the idea of decisions being made over a whiskey at 10 o'clock at night is not what institutions necessarily need to look like. And we've seen this. When you bring women into institutions in equal numbers, you shift the working hours, you shift the way of working, you shift the cooperation across the aisle on a number of issues. And so I would say that we need to tackle this on the unpaid care work side, but we also need to tackle it in our institutional transformation.
Mm-hmm. That's brilliant, Nahla. I couldn't agree more. Now, while you're talking, let me move on to the set of questions that deal with another worrisome reality, violence against women, which, as we heard, you know, has only increased in the conditions of confinement and economic precariousness. I know, Nahla, that over the last year, together with parity, it is the major source of your energies has gone to coordinating the UN-EU Spotlight Initiative to eliminate violence against women and girls. Can you explain briefly what this initiative was about, some outcomes and you know, further challenges, but also whether you see any of these gains threatened in this new pandemic setting?
Yeah. Thanks, Ruth. I think just going back to, and Simonetta raised it right at the beginning, you know, we are seeing a shadow pandemic, as UN Women has termed it, an increase in violence against women and girls across the globe in all societies and all forms. That includes domestic violence, intimate partner violence, but it also includes sexual exploitation, trafficking, online abuse, and femicide. Horrifically, the increase in femicide in a lot of countries has just been incredibly alarming. And we have to recognize that this violence is an increase on an already incredibly high baseline. You know, the statistic we often talk about 1 in 3 women will experience violence in their lifetime, it masks the fact that many women experience multiple experiences of violence during their lifetime, and it masks the impact that it has intergenerationally on health, on income, on the range of women's rights. And I think this increase in these past months has really forced us to look at the fact that everything that we've been doing in these last years to address the issue of violence against women has clearly had very shallow roots. And one of the issues that was raised earlier was this issue of social behavioral cultural change. And that is where we really need to be targeting our efforts going forward. So Spotlight Initiative, yes, a partnership between the UN and the EU. It's a 500 million euro investment. It's the largest investment that has ever been made in these issues. And you know, it is incredible that the EU had the courage to do that. It is a drop in the bucket, and we need others to come to the table in the same way. We're trying to model a new way of working with civil society and women's movements at the center of it, a real focus on prevention, as Maruša raised, this has to be the critical thing that we're focused on. And it has been a challenge this year in trying to sustain the gains. We are seeing the pushback, we are seeing an increase, and we're really trying to reflect on how it is that we consolidate on the forward movement that we had and what we need to address. And I think I'll just say one thing on that, and that is that we need to start talking about this as what it is. We need to start talking about male violence. And, you know, at the beginning of this pandemic, we were hearing people say there's an increase in violence against women because of the COVID-19 crisis. it's not an increase in violence against women because of a virus. It isn't a virus that is harming women. And it's not an increase because of socioeconomic pressure. As the colleagues have mentioned, it's women who are disproportionately affected by the socioeconomic pressures of COVID-19. We have to have accountability for male violence, and we have to call it out for what it is, and we have to start addressing the cultural, attitudinal, behavioral changes that we need, so that we have deeper roots in addressing this going forward.
Thank you, Nahla. And I want to read out a comment which arrived just a few minutes ago, because it precisely refers to cultural change that is needed. And it's Claudia Padovani. Hello, Claudia, who says, we hear profound cultural change is needed to envision futures for the EU and beyond. But reference to culture, communication, media seems to be lacking also in programs and strategies that address gender issues. So beyond emergency measure, Claudia suggests a longer-term perspective is needed to foster cultural gender transformative change. So I think that the comment is exactly on spot and underscores your affirmation, Nahla. Maruša, in terms of violence against women, you mentioned that there's an upcoming study, and I just got a question by Daniela Latinoglu, and basically, she asks two questions. I will raise the first one now and maybe the second one a bit later. And the first one is whether you can anticipate some of the preliminary results, especially concerning best practices on the mapping and prevention of violence against women during the pandemic.
I can't really now talk about the survey itself. We don't have these preliminary results yet, but I can maybe highlight a few of the good practices which we have mapped in our other type of work, asking member states on their responses to lockdowns and how to better support women victims of intimate partner violence. I guess we have heard or seen from the media that there have been many very quick supportive initiatives from special help provided to women in the places where they could go during lockdown, so be it pharmacies or shopping centers and so on. So there the support was given, be it safe phone numbers or providing safe phone calls to support services and so on. Then many countries quickly switch their support services to this kind of online support services, not phone calls or hotlines, but really untraceable apps that women could use when calling for help. Then, yes, many countries, they during lockdown, they had to scale down on their in their safe houses also, but they managed to adapt very quickly to provide other available spaces so that they could also ensure safety measures. So these are a few I can maybe raise now, but more is coming in the study.
Thank you, Maruša. So we hear things that are being done. We hear things that ought to be done and are not yet being done. I just got a comment. Letizia Lojaco suggests in terms of advancing hiring policies, what about conditioning the resources to male industries, about the implementation, retrospective or prospective, of gender balance in hiring policies? This is one more suggestion. I'm sure that many more. You mentioned public procurement conditions. I'm sure that many more could be put forward. I do want to, however, we have 10 minutes left, ask you all one question before our program is up, which is, of course, it seems that we're all obviously shattered by the pandemic, by the gender impact of the pandemic. But even before the pandemic started, we, and by we, I mean everyone who was working on the cause of advancing a more gender just society, we were having a battle already. It is difficult to make progress in the directions you're all indicating in a context where, you know, gender equality, gender approaches, gender mainstreaming, gender in academia are being, for the first time ever, just bluntly confronted in a movement that is global in scale, seems to be very articulate and organized politically, legally. We are confronting a gender equality backlash. Now, you know, to some extent, we could say that this is a sign of success. We see the backlash because women are raising to higher levels of power, and therefore, you know, that is just threatening the old structures. But I do want to hear from you quickly, you know, how you assess, you know, how you understand and interpret this gender equality backlash movement, but also whether you have any suggestions about how to best combat it. So I'm going to start with Simonetta and ask her view on this, begging you to be really brief so that we can finish on time.
Thank you, Ruth. I think what is really puzzling me is that we have past experiences of crisis. For instance, we know that after the Asian crisis of 2008, the rescue measures went to the male sectors, so construction, energy, etc. And the female intensive sectors were left behind, and many women were dismissed. What we are doing at the present is exactly the same. Again, we are focusing in those sectors that end up being the male intensive sector. We have at the present an incredible amount of money. For instance, in the EU member countries have never had so much money to spend to building back better. And what is really amazing is how the gender considerations have been completely put aside. So more than, you know, of course, the backlash, as Ruth, you said, in a blunt way, is perhaps the first time we perceive it so openly. But to me, the backlash is also saying we have billions to spend, and we don't pay any attention to channel some of these funds to the sectors where women work to improve their situation. So to me, we go back to this problem of the so-called lip service. Whatever, I mean, lip service is a common phenomenon, but I think in the gender field is extremely more common than in other fields. So to have this very good intention to set very ambitious goals, and then when it comes to everyday life and when it comes to money and how money should be distributed and what are the priorities, then all of a sudden all these good intentions somehow evaporates. So what I would really like to see is less lip service and more coherence between the goals, the statements, and what happens in reality. Thank you.
Nahla, maybe your word on this. You know that there's increasing resistance around the Istanbul Convention, the ratification of the Istanbul Convention, you know, to prevent violence against women. So yes, lip service and hypocrisy is an evil, but this is bigger than that. Some countries are questioning, you know, whether adopting a convention to fight for women's right to life and integrity is pure ideology. Nahla, what do you have to say to that?
Great, thanks, Ruth. So the one thing that I think that we need to come out of this year and this experience of this crisis having secured is women's equal leadership. At all levels, in all decision-making forums. And the only way that we are going to get there is by putting a strong emphasis on quotas and temporary special measures. And I say this, you know, not all women are feminists, not all women share the same ideals. And yet, as we were talking about earlier, just by ensuring gender-balanced, equal, inclusive leadership, you ensure that you are catering to the needs of all of society. and that is the need for protection from violence, for equal economic gains, for policy to suit. You know, we talk about 70% of our healthcare workers on the front lines are women. Their PPE does not fit them because it's made for a standard issue sized man. And so until we have women in all positions of leadership and decision making, we can't transform the way in which we make policy and decisions. And so this is something for the UN. The Secretary General has just issued a call to action on human rights in the last year. And within that, we have a specific strategic intervention on temporary special measures and quotas. It's something on temporary special measures that the SG has just updated our own within the UN system. And we are really advocating with member states that this has to be one critical factor that we emerge from these months with a focus on, is achieving women's balanced, equal representation and leadership.
In my dream world, and I know you're referring to temporary special measures because that is the language of CEDA, of the Convention on the Elimination against Discrimination Against Women, and it refers to temporary special measures. And in my dream world, these would not be temporary measures. They would only be temporary to the extent that at some point they might not be needed. But in my ideal world, what we should be witnessing in the 21st century is a new understanding of democracy, whereby unless you have gender balanced in representation, you simply have a democratic problem. So it should be permanent and not temporary, and it should be a requirement of legitimacy and not just the outcome of the recognition of fairness and human rights. I think our time is almost up. Maruša, is there something really pressing that you want to say before we greet us goodbye?
Yes, maybe on this last point, what were you raising on anti-gender equality movements, on how it affects the rights of women, how puts their lives at stake in a way, trying to withdraw from the Istanbul Convention and so on, and what we are facing and what us as feminists, as promoters of gender equality and women's rights are facing is very strong narratives which build on people's emotions. And it's very important to understand these narratives, to even though sometimes we have a feeling that's ununderstandable, we can't even understand that, on what this is based, yeah? But in order to build somehow anti-narratives to these arguments these movements are using, it's very important to have kind of evidence-based narratives. And this is where AGE is also putting its effort right now. So we are preparing designing possible narratives to counter this anti-gender equality narratives. So we will have a brief research collecting evidence on this anti-gender equality narratives, addressing these main narratives, and we would like to provide examples of let's say counter narratives to counter the backlash. And we are expecting results of this study also by the end of this year. And the main objective is of course for our internal use as AGE, when we work or when we go and have meetings with our stakeholders, as well as support our stakeholders, civil society organizations, be it civil servants in the countries with rising problems and this kind of movements and so on. So this is also another thing I wanted to share.
Thank you, Maruša. This is really interesting and useful. Our time is up. We are getting greetings from the globe, from Jakarta to Siena, US, Portugal. I mean, it is really exciting to see the whole globe listening to you. Let me, before I conclude, seize the opportunity to tell you that next Wednesday, September 30th at 5, there will be another webcast, this time to discuss the impact of COVID in Latin America. I wish you all a good rest of the day. I thank you. I thank my speakers, and I thank the audience for engaging with such interesting questions. Let's hope for a better world. We don't want to go back to normal. We want a new normal.
You know. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.